All right, folks, here we are back, continuing on part two of our notes on chapter 30, the crisis of authority. Today, what we're going to cover is basically President Richard Nixon's foreign policy objectives in regards to the Vietnam War and relations with communist countries around the world. I'm going to go ahead and say it again. I'm going to try to keep this one a little bit shorter. I'm 0 for like my last 20 attempts at that. And of course, I got to remind you to, if you enjoy this content, to go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe to my channel, where you're going to get the best AP US history prep content with low level resolution quality. So, anyway, enough with all that. Let's go ahead and get into the content. So, last time we talked about kind of social changes going on during the 1960s and 70s. The women's movement, the environmental movement, the youth culture and the counterculture, and how that was such a dominant force in the 60s and 70s. What we're going to talk about today is the presidency, a little bit of Richard Nixon, which is ultimately kind of an infamous presidency. So first off, when last we left talking about the political side of things, we're talking about the difficult election of 1968, which we know was a terrible year and terrible things were happening, and things just ultimately did not go particularly well for the Democrats that year. Lyndon Johnson decides not to run for re-election. And Robert Kennedy gets assassinated. Eugene McCarthy is kind of a random candidate who has some passionate supporters, but not enough to win. And then you have George Wallace, who is kind of like the Southern candidate, pro segregation and all that stuff, and he realistically isn't going to win either. So this catapults, of course, Richard Nixon to the presidency. Now, we know Richard Nixon is kind of a shady guy, tricky dick, as he was called, and how his presidency kind of evaporated with the whole Watergate scandal. But I'm going to tell you today a little bit of some of the ways that Nixon really kind of shined during his presidency. And one way Richard Nixon was very strong and very good was his skill with foreign policy. He learned a lot of that while he was vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, and he was a skilled politician to begin with anyway. And we see that, even though his presidency is so overshadowed by Watergate and being the only president to resign, Richard Nixon does some interesting things, both good and a little bit shady, in regards to not only the Vietnam War, but also our relationship, particularly with communist countries. I'll get into that a little bit later. Okay, so one person who's very important to the success of Richard Nixon's presidency is a guy named Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was a Harvard professor who was a very significant figure in the administration of Richard Nixon. Kissinger was very good with foreign policy, and he was the national security advisor under Nixon. And probably, well, not probably, definitely the most influential and most important figure in President Nixon's administration. Kissinger is the guy responsible for a lot of the talks and decisions and well thought out responses to the problems that still exist in Vietnam. So here we are in the early 1970s and trying to figure out, what are we going to do about this Vietnam problem? Because things aren't getting better in Vietnam. In fact, they're getting worse. So Nixon and Kissinger come up with a lot of different policies with which to handle that. Funny thing about Kissinger, he was an old guy when he worked with Nixon. He was in his late 50s. well, mid 50s, late 50s. He's still alive. He's almost 98 years old. He's still alive and kicking, which I just think is the funniest thing. But yeah, Henry Kissinger's still living. In fact, he was helped the Bush administration during 9/11. Was the chair of the 9/11 commission that kind of helped determine what happened after the terrorist attacks on 9/11. But anyway, one of the first plans or ideas that Nixon and Kissinger come up with is this concept of Vietnamization. This is our plan, a plan and policy to um, gradually kind of remove United States involvement in Vietnam. Gradually remove our troops from Vietnam slowly but surely, while at the same time giving money, financing, and providing weapons and other needed materials to the South Vietnamese army to continue the fight against North Vietnam, against communist incursion. Okay, this is a realization that continued fighting there is not a good thing, and um, we need to kind of gradually lessen our involvement there. Again, this is something else that we can apply to today, as Biden just recently announced that we're going to be removing our troops from Afghanistan now after almost 20 years of being involved in the conflict in conflict in Afghanistan. So there's a tie-in with today in regards to that. But again, Vietnamization, gradually removing U.S. direct troops in favor of instead providing money and needed military equipment to the South Vietnamese so they can do the fighting against the communists, against the North Vietnamese. Is that going to work? Well, you be the judge of that. As we continue on through the slide, you'll be able to answer that question. All right. So what we see happen at the peak of Vietnam, the United States has about 540,000 troops in Vietnam. By 1972, it's Nixon's goal, and he succeeds, to get that number down to about 60,000 troops as we gradually move our soldiers out of Vietnam. Of course, what this results in is escalation of the conflict, as now the North Vietnamese see a window and an opening with which they'll be able to attack into Vietnam with less resistance. But before it gets to that point, the United States actually escalates our involvement to some degree in Vietnam, not through troops kind of being there and doing physical fighting, but instead through bombing raids and our involvement in the nearby country of Cambodia. Nixon decides that, well, with intelligence, decides that Cambodia, the country next door to Vietnam, has been harboring basically and providing military bases for the North Vietnamese so that they could attack South Vietnam. So we start bombing Cambodia. We bomb it like crazy. And so that is kind of a form of escalation. We're not committing more troops to the conflict technically, but we are committing more in terms of bombing raids and trying to strike more at the military heart of the North Vietnamese, in hoping to kind of save face a little bit and end the conflict there in Vietnam. So, well, let me erase this real quick. So anyway, not long after this escalation begins, and we see this, people look at Nixon and say, oh, you're lying about our involvement now. We're actually still involved. We're still doing stuff. Okay. And this, of course, makes the American people angry and results in increased protests against the Vietnam War. Most notably, the shootings at Kent State, May 4th, 1970. May 4th, 1970, there was a student protest at Kent State University in Ohio. One night, some storefronts, windows were broken and stuff like that, and the protests spill into the next day, and the National Guard is called in. Now, these are unarmed students, And ultimately, the National Guard, after these students started throwing like bottles and stuff towards the National Guard, they opened fire, killing four white American college students, killing four students, and injuring several others. 9 or 10 others were injured. This, of course, it sets off, triggers all kinds of anger and frustration about the Nixon administration. He is kind of, since it's the National Guard, he is kind of blamed for what happens here, is held personally responsible, and the people are really upset. Throwing more fuel on the fire. We can't trust the government. This whole Vietnam thing's not going well, and now our government is escalating to the point where they're firing upon, American students. Interesting thing about Kent State. So my AP US history teacher in high school was actually a student at Kent State when the shootings happened. It was the most interesting thing. The one thing I really remember about learning about this course from him was how passionate he was about what happened at Kent State. We actually went there, not really, kind of on a field trip, kind of on a college visit thing. I don't even remember. It was my junior year. He walked us around and showed us the spots where the shooting was and what it was to him and all these other things. And it was really just really super interesting to get the perspective on what happened from somebody that was actually there, that was there to experience real history. So anyway, another blow to kind of what is continually happening now in Vietnam is something called the Pentagon Papers. Okay, so the Pentagon Papers were basically these published reports from the Department of Defense that confirmed to the American people that the government, and not just Nixon's government, this goes back to when Johnson was president too, that the government has kind of been lying to or not been forthcoming to the American people about our involvement in Vietnam and why we're there and what we're doing and how it's going and how much it costs and all these other things. Okay? So again, the Pentagon Papers, the guy that publishes them, a guy by the name of Daniel Ellsberg, kind of becomes a important historical name, gets death threats and all that stuff, as you would expect from the government, But what they do is produce again these papers that just confirm to the American people that essentially our government has been lying to them lying to the people about what's been going on in Vietnam and all this other stuff. So that's kind of a big moment. All of this, right, adds to this whole idea of the 1970s and this growing mistrust with the government. Vietnam builds that. Some of the challenges and failures in the civil rights movement helped grow that. The deaths of Dr. King and Robert Kennedy, all these things in the late 60s and then in the early 70s add to this growing general mistrust of the federal government that, again, because of what we'll talk about tomorrow, Watergate, is still going to continue to get worse before it gets better. Something else that kind of makes things worse. Richard Nixon gets this idea around Christmas 1972 that with everybody distracted by the holiday, this would be a good time to bomb Cambodia and Vietnam again. And basically, the public, these bombings would go unnoticed by the public while they're celebrating the holidays, and we can get out of Vietnam and everything, a little bit easier with sending off some last bombings, I guess, to the Vietnamese people. There's not a whole ton of public reaction to this, but it's another example of something that just further expresses kind of the shadiness of Richard Nixon. And another example of the distrust of the government as it continues to do these things essentially behind the back of the American people. So Nixon's whole objective, also helped and aided by Kissinger, is this concept of peace with honor. His whole goal is to get out of Vietnam in an honorable way and achieve peace in Vietnam in an honorable way. Not by quitting the war or giving up or admitting defeat, but trying to broker a deal with the Vietnamese to create peace between the two sides and ultimately have the United States be able to leave Vietnam with their head held high. That's the whole goal for Nixon here. Um, Ultimately, he thinks he achieves that in late 1972, but of um, within a few weeks of our 1972, when we ultimately decide to leave Vietnam officially, um, which this gradual reduction would still take a couple of years until like everybody is gone. Um, as soon as that happens, the North Vietnamese attack Vietnam again. The Cambodians, who have now gone communist, um, stage an attack in Cambodia. Ultimately, um, under the leadership of a guy by the name of Pol Pot, who I'm not going to talk about much, but Pol Pot is like the Hitler of Southeast Asia. Killed as many as 12 million people in something called the killing fields in the late 1970s in Cambodia. So this is a really bad guy too, who rises to power because of the unrest in Vietnam that in part was not caused but helped by American efforts there. Okay. Ultimately, defeat in Vietnam comes in 1975. The North Vietnamese finally sack the city of Saigon, rename it Ho Chi Minh City, and the famous image of the North Vietnamese, the video image of the North Vietnamese soldiers attacking the Capitol building as the last, literally as the last helicopter containing any Americans or pro-American Vietnamese people are literally leaving as the whole place is being stormed and taken over by North Vietnamese. Ending the chapter in a story on a war, the Vietnam War, which is a blow to American prestige around the world, is a blow to American self-confidence, is a war, frankly, that's the first war that America can really say it's lost. I guess you could say half of America lost the Civil War. Some could make an argument that we lost the War of 1812, but the British left, so I guess that's a win. But Vietnam is a loss for America, and it's one that's going to take time for America to get over. And it won't be for at least a decade and a half before we kind of make up for the embarrassing failure of the conflict in Vietnam. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit, talk a little bit more about Nixon and Kissinger and some of the good stuff they did in terms of foreign relations. I mentioned before, Richard Nixon is very good with foreign policy. Richard Nixon, at the end of the day, is actually a very skilled politician. And that's probably part of what ultimately destroys him politically, because Tricky Dick is up to these old political tricks that ultimately he doesn't get away with. Now, Nixon has what we call this multipolar vision. In other words, rather than having the United States and the Soviet Union always going at it through, containment policy and stuff like that, Nixon feels the world is a stronger place when the powerful countries of the world can kind of manage and lead in their regions of the world. And this includes like Japan and China and Great Britain and other European countries and the Soviet Union. This is Nixon's vision. Rather than this constant battle between communism and democracy between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, we need to find another way to create kind of a peaceful coexistence between the two sides, which is really ironic because earlier in Nixon's career, he was a big time anti-communist, go after the commies type guy, and now suddenly he sees the world as a place where we have to find a common ground between one another. And he does a very good job with this to a certain degree. One of Nixon's big goals is to some degree, open up diplomatic talks with China. He sends Henry Kissinger over to China to kind of talk to their leaders and say, hey, can we get to the table together? Because basically from 1949, hopefully I'm not going too fast, but basically from 1949, when communist China was formed under Mao Zedong, up until now, the early 1970s, the United States has not even recognized China as an actual country. Our relations with China were recognized by the old Chinese government, which is now in the island of Taiwan. Nixon wants to change that, so he sends Kissinger over there and begins low-level diplomatic talks with China, promising ultimately to visit China, which he does in 1972. This is a big deal. This is the first time not only that a sitting president has visited China, but also really the first time that a sitting president has visited it for diplomatic reasons with a communist country. This is the beginning of talks of lessening, the tension between the countries. China, doing it with China, and then ultimately this went fairly well diplomatically, creates an opportunity to do the same thing with the Soviet Union, to create a sense of détente. What the word détente means, it's a French term for the easing of tensions. And Nixon does a very good job, ultimately, of easing the tensions that had existed throughout the height of the Cold War, containment and all this other stuff between the United States, the Soviet Union, and other communist countries in general. Bring each other to the table, talk out our differences, and try to find some common ground. They do ultimately find some common ground and create the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, known as SALT I. There would later be a SALT II. But the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty basically states to the United States and the Soviet Union that we're not going to create any more nuclear warheads. We're going to greatly limit our nuclear proliferation program. We're going to make an agreement that, we're not going to start to reduce our number, either country, the Soviet Union or the United States. We're not going to start to reduce our number of nuclear weapons, but we're not going to continue to actively create more and increase the threat of there being some major nuclear proliferation that's going to destroy the world. So this is a good thing. This is a successful thing. For the first time, the Soviets and the Americans are at least trying to find a way to ease tension and work through their differences. This is one success, one definite success of Nixon's presidency. Nixon also moves forward with what becomes known as the Nixon Doctrine. Okay, the Nixon Doctrine is his new approach to dealing with third world countries in the age of the Cold War. Okay, so what the Nixon Doctrine basically states is it has three parts. Okay, number one, the United States will continue to honor existing treaties it has with other nations. Okay, we will continue to honor the treaties that we've already brokered and created with other foreign countries, alliances and stuff like that. Number two, the U.S. will act as a nuclear shield against countries with nuclear power that pose a threat against smaller countries. In other words, if country A, if the Soviet Union points its nukes at some small African country, the United States will have their back. We don't have to have an alliance, but we'll say, wait a minute, if you fire your nukes on, Ethiopia, then that will be considered an act of war and we will respond to that. Okay, so that's what a nuclear shield is. And three, the U.S. will provide economic assistance to nations threatened by other stronger nations, but not with actual boots on the ground fighting. Okay, what this means is essentially, in some form, this is the end of containment policy. Okay, we're not going to try to install new governments in foreign countries with hopes to prevent them from becoming communists. What we will do instead is use our power as the quote unquote leader of the free world to deter other stronger, more powerful countries from trying to take advantage of weaker third world countries. Again, we'll honor the treaties that we have, right? So like South Korea, countries in Europe that we have treaties with, we'll continue to honor those, NATO and stuff, but we're not going to create any new treaties. Number two, we act as a nuclear shield. In other words, we have nukes, little third world country does not. If country with nukes threatens little third world country, then we'll step in. And then three, we'll send money, we'll send guns, we'll send whatever to some of these foreign countries that are threatened by bigger countries. But what we won't do is send soldiers. We're not going to send soldiers like we did in Vietnam and escalate that to 500,000 plus soldiers over there in Vietnam. So this is a whole new way of dealing with third world countries and how we look at our role in the world. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And we'll talk about it a little bit in class in the coming days. I think that's all I have for this. So I'm going to go say goodbye now. But if not, we'll continue with the discussion. And, yep, oh, sorry, that's one more point. So last thing here that proves to be kind of a big problem. And America is growing their involvement. America is growing their involvement in the Middle East because the Middle East has a lot of oil. And the Middle East oil exporting countries are known as OPEC. And they basically control the world's oil supply. We have a ton of oil in the United States. We just don't want to use it. Well, being upset with the United States for a variety of reasons, among them Detente and other things, the Arabs put an embargo on oil being sent to the United States, greatly limiting our access to oil. So what does this do? It causes gas prices to grow through the roof. In some places, gas isn't as expensive as like $5 a gallon, $4.50 to $5 a gallon during the early 1970s. Translated into today's money, you're talking $13, $14, $15 a gallon of gas. So the American people, very frustrated by that. Gas is necessary, want to see a solution to this problem. And this is kind of the beginning of the United States shift in involvement a little bit more to the Middle East. We have oil interests in the Middle East, which means financial interests, which means we need to do whatever we can to ensure that there's a steady supply of oil, gas, coming into the United States. The Arab oil embargo proves this. It's part of a larger problem in the early 1970s known as the energy crisis, which I'm really not going to get into in too much detail. But these are problems that hamper the Nixon administration, and the people become very, very frustrated with the oil embargo. But that'll soon be forgotten because they'll find out that the president is lying and stealing information, and the whole Watergate thing happened. So anyway, that is the end. I lied to you. I didn't make it too much shorter, but darn it, I'm going to give it one more chance tomorrow. So talk to you later.